It was her first Christmas in America, and Taruko Brennan had no idea who sat beside her. The snow outside the farmhouse window fell in thick, silent curtains, covering the Nebraska plains in a whiteness so complete it felt like erasure. Inside, the air smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and pine, scents that meant nothing to her, that carried no memory, no warmth. She sat at the long wooden table, hands folded in her lap, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, while voices rose and fell around her, in a language she only half understood. Her husband Clifford squeezed her hand under the table, smiling at her with those kind blue eyes that had first made her believe she could survive this new world. But tonight, surrounded by strangers whose laughter felt like a wall she could not climb, Taruko felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. And then the man beside her turned, and in the moment their eyes met, something ancient and unspeakable passed between them, a recognition that made her blood run cold, that dragged her back across an ocean and 2 years of carefully constructed forgetting, back to the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming, back to a place where this man's face had been the last thing she saw before everything changed forever. The Christmas of 1947 came to the Brennan farmhouse like it did every year, with Opal Brennan's meticulous planning and iron will. She had been preparing for weeks, ever since Clifford had written to say he was bringing his new wife home from Japan. Opal had said nothing in her letters back, only that they would celebrate Christmas as they always had, with the whole community gathered, with Father Brendan saying grace, with Dr. Grayson and his wife Corinne coming from town. What she did not write was the tightness in her chest every time she thought of a Japanese woman sitting at her table, eating from her dishes, sleeping under her roof. The war had taken her brother, Clifford's uncle Eugene, somewhere in the Pacific. The telegram had said only that he was missing, presumed dead. For 2 years she had waited for more information, for closure, for anything. It never came, and now her son had married one of them. Taruko had known, from the moment she stepped off the train in Grand Island and saw the way Opal's mouth tightened into a thin line, that she was not welcome. Clifford had tried to prepare her, had told her his mother needed time, that the war was still fresh for everyone, that love would eventually win out. But Taruko knew better. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of American soldiers who guarded the refugee camps, in the faces of aid workers who handed out rations with gloved hands, as if Japanese skin carried contagion. She had learned to recognize hatred in all its forms, and Opal's was the quiet, civilized kind, the kind that never raised its voice but made itself known in 1,000 small ways. The way she set Taruko's place at the far end of the table, the way she spoke slowly and loudly, as if Taruko were a child or an imbecile, the way she never, not once, used her name. The farmhouse was larger than Taruko had expected, a 2-story white structure with a wraparound porch and a red barn visible through the kitchen window. It sat alone on the plains, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, a loneliness that reminded her of the ocean. Clifford had grown up here, had worked this land with his father before the war, and now that his father was gone, the farm was his. He spoke of it with pride, with a sense of belonging that Taruko could not imagine feeling. In Japan, she had lived in Naha, in a neighborhood where houses pressed against each other like teeth, where you could hear your neighbors breathing through the walls, where the smell of miso soup and grilled fish drifted through every window. Here the silence was absolute. At night, lying beside Clifford in the bed that had been his since childhood, Taruko would stare at the ceiling and listen to the wind howling across the empty fields, and she would feel as if she had been exiled to the edge of the world. She tried to make herself useful. Every morning she woke before dawn and prepared rice in the small pot she had brought from Japan, the only possession she had been allowed to keep. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness that seemed to irritate Opal rather than please her. She learned to use the washing machine, the electric stove, the vacuum cleaner, all these American machines that hummed and roared and made her feel clumsy and inadequate. Clifford was patient, endlessly patient, demonstrating each task with a gentleness that made her want to cry. But patience was not the same as understanding. He could not know what it felt like to wake up every morning in a country that had bombed yours into submission, to walk through a town where every face turned to stare, to hear the language of your nightmares spoken casually over breakfast. He could not know because she could not tell him. There were no words in English or Japanese for what she had survived. The invitation to the Christmas gathering had come from Father Brendan Kavanagh, the priest at St. Catherine's in town. He had visited the farm twice since Teruko's arrival, both times bringing small gifts: a English-Japanese dictionary, a book of American customs, a rosary that Teruko accepted politely, though she was not Christian. Father Brendan was different from Opal. His kindness felt genuine, uncomplicated by resentment. He had served as a chaplain in the Pacific, he told her, had seen the aftermath of the battles, had blessed the dying on both sides. He spoke a little Japanese, enough to ask her how she was managing, whether she needed anything, whether she had found peace. Teruko had smiled and nodded and said nothing of substance. Peace was not something you found. It was something you pretended to have until the pretending became a kind of truth. The gathering was Father Brendan's idea, a way to bring the community together, to help the war brides integrate into American life. There were 3 other Japanese women in the county, all married to veterans, all living on isolated farms or in the margins of small towns. Father Brendan had been organizing monthly meetings at the church, occasions for the women to speak Japanese together, to share food from home, to remember that they were not completely alone. Teruko had attended once. The other women had been kind, but their stories were too much like her own, and hearing them spoken aloud made the pain sharper, not duller. She had not gone back. But Christmas was different. Christmas was mandatory. Opal had made that clear. The Brennans would attend, all of them, and Teruko would wear the dress Clifford had bought her in Omaha, the green one with the white collar, and she would smile and be grateful and prove to the town that her husband had not made a mistake. On Christmas Eve, Teruko stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom and tried to see herself as the Americans would see her. The dress fit well enough, though the color made her skin look sallow. She had curled her hair the way the magazines showed, pinned it back with clips that dug into her scalp. She wore lipstick, red and foreign, on her mouth, and the small pearl earrings Clifford had given her as a wedding gift. She looked, she thought, like a doll, like something decorative and breakable, meant to be admired from a distance but never truly known. Clifford came up behind her and kissed her cheek, told her she was beautiful, told her everything would be fine. She wanted to believe him. She had built her entire life on the foundation of that wanting. But as they drove into town, past the snow-covered fields and the dark shapes of farmhouses lit from within, Teruko felt a dread settling over her like a weight, a certainty that something was waiting for her in that church hall, something she had been running from since the day she left Japan. The church hall was decorated with garlands of pine and red ribbon, with candles burning on every table, with the enormous tree in the corner hung with ornaments that caught the light and threw it back in fragments. The room was already crowded when they arrived, filled with families Teruko did not know, children running between tables, men in suits shaking hands and laughing, women in their best dresses clustering near the kitchen. Teruko felt every eye turned toward her as they entered. The conversations did not stop, but they shifted, became quieter, more careful. Clifford kept his hand on her back, steering her through the room, introducing her to people whose names she immediately forgot. Everyone was polite, everyone smiled. And beneath every smile, Teruko felt the question they were too well-mannered to ask. "What are you doing here?" Father Brendan found them near the punch bowl and greeted Teruko in Japanese, a simple phrase, "Welcome, I am glad you came," that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He introduced them to Dr. Silas Grayson and his wife Corinne, a handsome couple in their early 30s. Corinne was vivacious, talkative, immediately taking Teruko's hand and telling her how lovely she looked, how wonderful it was to have her in the community, how they simply must have her and Clifford over for dinner soon. Dr. Grayson was quieter. He shook Clifford's hand, nodded to Teruko, and said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than was comfortable, and Teruko felt a flutter of unease. She told herself she was imagining things. She had become paranoid in this new country, seeing threats where none existed. But the feeling persisted. When they sat down for dinner, Teruko found herself placed between Clifford and Dr. Grayson. Corinne was on the doctor's other side, already deep in conversation with Opal about recipes and the difficulties of finding good help. Clifford was talking to Father Brendan about the farm, about the challenges of the coming planting season, about whether the new tractor would arrive in time. Teruko sat in silence, hands folded in her lap, staring at the plate of food before her. The turkey was dry, the mashed potatoes bland, the cranberry sauce too sweet. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, aware only of the warmth of Dr. Grayson's arm inches from her own, of the way he had not looked at her since they sat down, as if he were deliberately avoiding it. Father Brendan stood to say grace, and the room fell silent. Taruko bowed her head and listened to the English words wash over her. Understanding perhaps half, she heard blessings and gratitude and peace on earth, phrases that sounded beautiful and empty. When the prayer ended and the conversations resumed, Dr. Grayson finally turned to her. His voice was low, careful. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "your husband tells me you're from Okinawa." Taruko's heart stopped. She forced herself to nod, to meet his eyes. They were gray, she noticed, the color of winter sky. "Yes," she said softly. "From Naha." Dr. Grayson's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition or pain or both. "I was there," he said, "in 45, with the Marines. I was a medic." The room seemed to tilt. Taruko gripped the edge of the table, willing herself to stay present, to not disappear into the memories that were suddenly flooding back. "I see," she managed to say. Her voice sounded distant, not her own. Dr. Grayson looked down at his plate. "It was a long time ago," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "A different world." But it was not a different world. It was the same world, the same history, sitting beside her at a Christmas table in Nebraska, wearing a suit and tie, eating turkey and pretending that the past could be buried under good manners and silence. Taruko wanted to stand up, to walk out of the hall, to run back to the farmhouse and lock herself in the bedroom and never come out. But she could not move. She was trapped, pinned in place by the weight of what she knew and what he knew, and what neither of them could ever say aloud. The meal continued around them. Corinne laughed at something Opal said. Clifford debated farming techniques with Father Brendan. Children chased each other between the tables, shrieking with joy. And Taruko sat beside Dr. Silas Grayson, the man who had been there, who had seen what she had seen, who carried the same ghosts, and they did not speak. The silence between them was louder than any words could have been. It was a silence full of smoke and screaming, of bodies in the rubble, of a city burning, of a girl hiding in a cave while the world ended above her. It was a silence that acknowledged everything and forgave nothing. Okinawa in the spring of 1945 had been hell on earth. Taruko had been 22 years old, living with her parents and younger brother in a small house on the outskirts of Naha. Her father was a school teacher, her mother a seamstress. They were not wealthy, but they had been comfortable, had believed that the war would pass them by, that Okinawa was too small, too unimportant to become a battlefield. They had been wrong. When the Americans landed, the Japanese military had conscripted every able-bodied man and boy, including Taruko's brother, who was 15. They had given him a rifle and 2 days of training and sent him to the front lines. Taruko never saw him again. The military had also ordered all civilians to evacuate to the caves in the hills, to stay there until the battle was over, to fight to the death rather than surrender. Her father had refused. He did not believe in dying for the emperor. He believed in protecting his family. So they had stayed in the house hidden in the cellar, listening to the bombs fall and the earth shake, praying that the walls would hold. They had held for 3 weeks. Then a shell had hit the house directly, collapsing the structure, trapping them in the cellar under tons of rubble. Taruko's father had been killed instantly, crushed by a falling beam. Her mother had survived for 2 days, her legs pinned, bleeding internally, whispering prayers and apologies until she finally fell silent. Taruko had been trapped beside her mother's body for another day, before the American soldiers found her. She remembered the sound of digging, of voices speaking English, of hands pulling away the debris. She remembered the light, blinding after so much darkness, and the faces of the soldiers staring down at her, their expressions a mixture of pity and revulsion. And she remembered one face in particular, a young man with gray eyes, who had climbed down into the rubble and checked her for injuries, who had spoken to her in a language she did not understand, whose hands had been surprisingly gentle as he lifted her out. She had been taken to a refugee camp, a sprawling collection of tents and makeshift shelters where thousands of Okinawan civilians lived in limbo, waiting for the war to end, waiting to learn if their families had survived, waiting for permission to return to homes that no longer existed. Taruko had spent 6 months there, working in the camp hospital, translating for the American medics who spoke no Japanese, trying to make herself useful so that she would not have to think about what she had lost. The medics had been kind mostly. They had treated the wounded, distributed food and medicine, tried to maintain order in the chaos. And among them had been a young Marine corporal named Silas Grayson, who worked longer hours than anyone else, who never seemed to sleep, who carried a haunted look in his gray eyes that Teruko recognized because she saw the same look in her own reflection. They had never spoken, not really. A few words in broken Japanese and English, instructions about patients, requests for supplies. But Teruko had noticed him. She had noticed the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the way he flinched at loud noises, the way he stood outside the medical tent at night, staring at the ruins of Naha in the distance, as if he were seeing something no one else could see. She had understood even then that he was as broken as she was, that the war had taken something from him that he would never get back. And then one day he was gone, rotated out with his unit, and Teruko had not thought of him again until tonight, until she sat beside him at a Christmas table and realized that the past was not past, that it was here, breathing beside her, impossible to escape. Dr. Grayson cleared his throat. "How are you finding Nebraska, Mrs. Brennan?" he asked, his voice determinedly casual, as if they were strangers making polite conversation, as if they did not share a history written in blood and ash. Teruko took a breath, forced herself to answer. "It is very different," she said carefully. "Very quiet." He nodded. "Yes, quiet. That's a good word for it." He paused, then added, "Sometimes I think it's too quiet. Makes it hard to forget." Teruko looked at him sharply, but his face was composed, neutral. Only his hands, gripping his fork too tightly, betrayed him. "Yes," she said softly. "Hard to forget." Corinne leaned across her husband, oblivious to the tension. "Silas, darling, you're being dreadfully dull. Talk to the poor girl about something cheerful. Tell her about the Christmas pageant. The children were absolutely darling this year, Teruko. You should have seen them. Little Susie Miller played Mary and forgot all her lines, just stood there staring at the audience until Father Brendan whispered them to her. It was precious." Teruko smiled politely, nodded, said something appropriate. But her mind was elsewhere, back in the camp, back in the rubble, back in the moment when Silas Grayson's hands had pulled her from the grave of her family and delivered her into a life she had never wanted. The dinner dragged on. Dessert was served, a pie made with apples and cinnamon that Teruko could not eat. Carols were sung, songs about peace and joy that felt like mockery. Father Brendan gave a short speech about community and forgiveness and new beginnings, and everyone applauded. Teruko applauded too, her hands moving mechanically, her face frozen in a smile that hurt her cheeks. Beside her, Dr. Grayson sat motionless, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, and Teruko wondered if he was seeing the same things she was seeing, if his mind was also filled with the ghosts of people who would never sit at a Christmas table, who would never taste apple pie, who would never sing carols or light candles or pretend that the world was anything other than what it was, a place of endless violence, briefly interrupted by moments of fragile peace. When the meal finally ended, people began to mingle, moving between tables, gathering in clusters to talk and laugh. Clifford was pulled away by a group of farmers, men who wanted to discuss crop prices and weather predictions. Opal disappeared into the kitchen with the other women. Father Brendan was surrounded by parishioners, and Teruko found herself standing alone near the Christmas tree, holding a cup of punch she had no intention of drinking, trying to look occupied so that no one would feel obligated to talk to her. She was studying the ornaments on the tree, delicate glass spheres painted with scenes of snow and stars, when Dr. Grayson appeared beside her. He did not look at her, kept his eyes on the tree, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I remember you," he said. It was not a question. Teruko's hands tightened around the cup. She said nothing. What was there to say? "You were in the camp," he continued, still not looking at her. "You worked in the hospital. You translated for us. You had a cut on your forehead here." He touched his own forehead, indicating the spot. Teruko remembered. The beam that had killed her father had grazed her skull, leaving a gash that had taken weeks to heal. The scar was still there, hidden beneath her hair. "I pulled you out of a collapsed house," Dr. Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You and your mother. Your mother didn't make it. I'm sorry. I tried. but there was too much damage. I'm sorry. Taruko closed her eyes. She had known her mother was dead, had watched her die, but hearing it confirmed by this man, by the one who had been there, made it real in a way it had not been before. It was not your fault, she said quietly. You did what you could. Did I? Dr. Grayson's voice was bitter. I don't know anymore. I don't know what I did or why I did it or if any of it mattered. I saved some people. I watched a lot more die. And now I'm here, eating turkey and pretending to be normal. And I don't know if that's a blessing or a punishment. He finally turned to look at her, and Taruko saw the rawness in his eyes, the guilt and grief that he carried like a physical weight. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? He asked. Like you died back there and this is just some strange dream you're having? Taruko met his gaze. Every day, she said. They stood in silence. Two survivors of the same war, the same battle, the same impossible history, surrounded by people who could never understand what they had seen, what they had lost, what it cost them to stand here and smile and pretend that Christmas was a time of joy. Around them, the party continued. Children laughed, carols played, the candles burned, and Taruko and Silas stood together in their separate silences, bound by a past that neither of them could speak aloud, that would remain forever between them, unacknowledged and undeniable. Does your wife know? Taruko asked finally. Silas shook his head. No, I've never told her. I've never told anyone. What would I say? That I can't sleep because I see their faces? That I hear the screaming every time it's quiet? That I became a doctor because I thought I could make up for all the people I couldn't save? But it doesn't work. It never works. Because they're still dead, and I'm still here? He laughed, a harsh, broken sound. She thinks I'm a war hero. She tells people I served with honor, and I let her believe it because it's easier than the truth. What is the truth? Taruko asked. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same question she had been asking herself since the day she left Japan. That we survived, he said. And I don't know if that makes us lucky or cursed. Clifford appeared then, smiling, oblivious, asking Taruko if she was ready to go home. She nodded, set down her untouched punch, and let him guide her toward the door. As they were leaving, she glanced back and saw Silas still standing by the tree, Corinne beside him now, chattering about something, her hand on his arm. He looked like a man drowning in plain sight, and no one could see it but Taruko. She understood then that they would never speak of this again, that they would pass each other in town and nod politely and pretend to be strangers, that the truth of what they shared would remain buried beneath the surface of their ordinary lives. It was the only way to survive. You carried your ghosts in silence, and you learned to live with the weight. On the drive home, Clifford talked about the evening, about how well it had gone, about how proud he was of Taruko, about how everyone had been so welcoming. Taruko listened and nodded and said the right things. She did not tell him about Dr. Grayson. She did not tell him about the camp, about her mother, about the moment she had been pulled from the rubble and delivered into a life that felt like exile. She did not tell him because he could not understand, because his kindness, however genuine, could not bridge the gulf between his experience of the war and hers. He had been a liberator. She had been the liberated. And those were not the same thing. When they reached the farmhouse, Opal was already in bed. Clifford kissed Taruko goodnight and went to check on the livestock. Taruko climbed the stairs to their bedroom, removed the green dress, the painful earrings, the red lipstick. She stood in front of the mirror in her slip and looked at her reflection. She looked like a ghost. She felt like a ghost. She wondered if Silas Grayson felt the same way, if he stood in front of his mirror at night and saw a stranger, if he wondered how he had ended up here, in this life, in this country, so far from the place where everything had been lost. She climbed into bed and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl across the plains. She thought about Christmas, about what it was supposed to mean: peace on earth, goodwill toward men, forgiveness, redemption, new beginnings. She thought about Silas Grayson, about the haunted look in his gray eyes, about the way he had said, "I remember you," as if it were a confession. She thought about all the other war brides scattered across America, women like her, living in farmhouses and small towns, married to men who loved them but could never truly know them, carrying their histories in silence, their grief in secret, their ghosts in the spaces between words. And she thought about Okinawa, about the house that had collapsed, about her mother's last breath, about her brother who had never come home, about the girl she had been before the war, the girl who had died in the rubble and been replaced by this stranger, this survivor, this woman who smiled and nodded and pretended to be grateful for a life she had never chosen. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the fields, the roads, the farmhouse, everything, in a whiteness that erased all boundaries, all distinctions, all evidence of what had come before. Teruko closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep did not come. It never did. Not really. Instead, she lay awake and listened to the silence, to the absence of sound that was louder than any noise. And she thought about the man who had sat beside her at Christmas dinner, the man who had pulled her from the grave, the man who carried the same ghosts, the same guilt, the same impossible weight. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that they were connected now, she and Silas Grayson, bound by a history that neither of them could escape, that would follow them for the rest of their lives, that would sit beside them at every table in every room, in every moment of fragile peace, reminding them of what they had survived and what they had lost and the unbearable cost of being alive. In the morning, Clifford would wake her with coffee and a kiss, would tell her it was Christmas Day, would give her a gift wrapped in bright paper, and Teruko would smile and open it and thank him, and she would mean it, because his love was real, even if it could not save her. She would go downstairs and help Opal prepare breakfast, and she would endure the cold silence, the pointed remarks, the 1,000 small cruelties that said you do not belong here. She would attend Christmas service at St. Catherine's and listen to Father Brendan preach about hope and renewal, and she would nod and pretend to believe. And if she saw Dr. Grayson there, sitting with his wife in the pew across the aisle, she would look away, would give him the gift of pretending they were strangers, would honor the unspoken agreement they had made without words, because that was what survivors did. They carried their truths in silence. They protected the people who loved them from the weight of what they knew. They lived their lives as best they could, one day at a time, one moment at a time, until the living became a kind of truth, until the pretending became real, until the ghosts faded, just enough to let the light in. But tonight, on her first Christmas in America, Teruko lay in the darkness and let herself remember. She remembered Naha before the bombs, the narrow streets and the smell of the sea, her brother's laugh, her mother's hands sewing by lamplight, her father reading poetry aloud. She remembered the camp, the endless rows of tents, the children with hollow eyes, the old women who wept without sound. She remembered Silas Grayson's face as he pulled her from the rubble, the surprise in his eyes when he realized she was alive, the gentleness of his hands as he checked her wounds. She remembered all of it, everything she had tried to forget, everything she had buried beneath the surface of her new American life, and she let herself cry, silently, so that Clifford would not hear, so that no one would know. She cried for her family, for her country, for the girl she had been, for the woman she had become. She cried for Silas Grayson and all the other soldiers who had survived the war but could not survive the peace. She cried for all the people who sat at Christmas tables and smiled and pretended, who carried their ghosts in silence, who lived their lives in the shadow of a history that could never be spoken aloud. And when the tears finally stopped, when the exhaustion finally pulled her under, Teruko slept. And in her sleep she dreamed of snow, endless and white and clean, covering everything, erasing everything, until there was nothing left but silence and forgetting, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might be easier than today. Years would pass. Teruko would learn English, would make a place for herself in the community, would eventually win over even Opal with her quiet persistence and grace. She would have children, 2 daughters who would grow up American, who would never quite understand their mother's silences, her faraway looks, the way she sometimes stood at the window and stared at the horizon as if she were searching for something that could never be found. She would see Silas Grayson occasionally in town, at church, at community events. They would nod to each other politely, would exchange pleasantries, would never again speak of what they shared, and that would be enough. It would have to be enough, because some truths were too heavy to carry together, some histories too painful to acknowledge. They had survived. They had built new lives, and if those lives were haunted, if they were lived in the shadow of ghosts, If they required a constant act of forgetting and pretending and enduring, well, that was the price of survival. That was what it meant to be a war bride, a veteran, a survivor. You carried your past in silence. You protected the people you loved from the weight of what you knew, and you learned to live with the ghosts, because the ghosts were all you had left of the people you used to be, the world you used to know, the life you used to live before everything changed forever. Teruka would grow old in Nebraska, would watch her daughters marry and have children of their own, would eventually bury Clifford and then Opal, would outlive most of the people who had sat at that Christmas table in 1947. And sometimes in her old age, she would think about that night, about the moment she had looked into Silas Grayson's gray eyes and seen her own history reflected back at her. She would wonder what had become of him, whether he had found peace, whether he had ever told his wife the truth, whether he still dreamed of Okinawa, of the rubble and the screaming and the endless dead. She would wonder if he remembered her, if he thought about that Christmas dinner, if he carried the same weight of silence and memory and impossible survival. And she would understand, with the wisdom that comes only with time and distance and the perspective of a life fully lived, that they had given each other a gift that night, she and Silas Grayson. Not the gift of understanding or forgiveness or healing. Those were too much to ask, too much to give, but the gift of recognition, the gift of being seen, truly seen, by someone who knew, who understood, who carried the same ghosts. The gift of not being alone, even in silence, even in the midst of a crowded room, even in a new country, and a new life, and a new identity that could never quite erase the old one. They had sat beside each other at a Christmas table, two survivors of the same war, the same battle, the same impossible history. And for one night, they had not been alone. And that, Teruka would come to understand, was the only kind of peace that was possible. Not forgetting, not healing, but the simple, profound recognition that someone else knew, someone else remembered, someone else carried the weight, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all they had. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage and resilience from history. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.